Forever and a Day. Chapter 1. Joseph Oster. 1934. Fog hung over the city. It was hot and thick, making each breath a struggle. The world was dark, not just because the sun had gone down, but because the souls of so many men and women were rotting away. Hope was gone. Dreams were destroyed. Luckily, Prohibition was over, and all of those damaged souls could drown their sorrows in a glass of whatever swill they could afford. 5 years since the market crashed, and happy days were here again, but only until last call. For Joe Oster, things could have been worse. He had a stable job delivering mail. He had a beautiful wife, Norma, and a little girl who looked at him as though he were the center of the universe. Maggie, 2 years old, and she already seemed to have the world figured out. She didn't cry about monsters under her bed or ask why she had to take a bath. When she looked at the world around her, it was as though she had skipped ahead and read the last chapter of the book before her story ever began. Joe sat with Maggie on the floor of her bedroom, watching her play with a set of blocks. She was quiet, and as he sat there with her, Joe felt the rest of the world melt away. With her, he was at peace. When she smiled, he smiled. When she cried, he couldn't help but cry along with her. She was beautiful. A wave of frustration washed over him. Though he hadn't taken his eyes off of Maggie, he could tell that someone was standing behind him. "Are you going out tonight?" Norma asked in a quiet tone, as though she were afraid to know the answer. And why shouldn't she be? Maggie smiled, and Joe couldn't help but smile with her. He never took his eyes off of her as he replied, "I don't know." "Why do you do this, Joe? Every night? Why?" Norma's voice trailed off toward the end of that question, and a lump rose in Joe's throat. He didn't answer her, because he didn't know what to say. There was no good reason for it. After waiting for a few moments, Norma walked off, and the only thing left in the room was Maggie's smile. Joe's eyes filled with tears, not because he was sad, but because of the love he felt in that moment, looking at the little girl who squealed with delight as she picked up a block and held it to her father's mouth. Joe pretended to bite that block. He chewed and swallowed that imaginary mouthful. "It's good?" Maggie asked him. "I think it's stale." She laughed, and the tears rolled down his cheek. Still smiling, she said, "Mommy's sad." "I know." "Why?" "Because she doesn't like it when I get sad." "You sad now?" "No, I'm never sad when I'm with you." "I'm not sad either." Maggie put her blocks aside and picked up her favorite doll. It was old and worn, and Joe wanted more than anything to get her a more beautiful doll, but Maggie wouldn't hear of it. She brushed the doll's yarn hair with her fingers and tilted her head so that she could look into the doll's eyes. She had named her doll Mrs. Dandridge, but Joe didn't know where the name came from. It was as though the doll itself had whispered it into Maggie's ear when nobody else was listening. "Lots of people sad, Daddy," Maggie told her father in a quiet tone, as if she didn't want her doll to hear. "I know, sweetheart." Maggie held the doll to her face, and, still whispering, she said, "Grandmother says it's going to get worse." Maggie sometimes spent the day with Norma's mother, Eugenia. The woman tried her best with the little girl, but she was never one to hold back her politics, even if Maggie was the only one around to hear her rant. Joe shook his head. "You can't believe everything your grandma says. I promise you, Roosevelt will give up the office same as everyone who came before him." Ay, don't get me started," Maggie smiled, rolling her eyes. Joe couldn't help but grin as he heard his daughter mimic the words of his mother-in-law. He wished that she could have known his mother. She always seemed to know just the right thing to say. She never seemed surprised when the world went to hell. She was always calm and had a smile to share, even when the situation didn't call for it. Maggie reminded him of his mother at times. Even the way she spoke reminded him of his mother, though the two of them had never met. Joe's mother had died 3 years before Maggie was born. Maggie took a deep breath, as though she was about to yawn, but she didn't. Instead, she looked her father in the eyes and said, "Careful, always look both ways." Then she smiled again, which turned into a laugh. Joe could tell that she was getting tired. Both. Maggie laughed as she picked up a block and smushed it into her doll's chest. Blah. She dropped her doll to the floor and shook her head at her father still smiling. She didn't look both ways, Maggie grinned. Joe smiled, but that feeling of peace that he'd had with his daughter was gone. When she became tired, she laughed for no reason. She spoke nonsense. Time for bed, little girl, Joe told her, standing up and brushing off his pants. Bed, 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 Maggie repeated as she stood and marched toward her bed. Though there were nights when she would fuss and throw a fit in order to stay up longer, Maggie was cooperative on this night. As she hopped into bed and pulled the covers over herself, Joe half expected her to tell him to get lost so that she could have some peace and quiet. Story, she yelled, waving her arms in the air like an orchestra conductor. Sta, 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 story. Joe sat on the edge of Maggie's bed and read her the story of Snow White and Rose Red as she began to drift off to sleep. Outside, Joe could hear a police siren moving up the street. A car horn honked. As Maggie's eyes closed and she began to nod off, Joe's stomach began to turn. The outside world was beginning to creep up on him, the same way it did every night. No matter how hard he tried to fight it, darkness always fell. As he finished the story and stepped into the hallway, Joe found Norma waiting for him. She leaned with her back against the wall, staring at the floor. She didn't bother to look up as he walked out of the bedroom. You always sound so happy when you're with her, Norma smiled, but her tone betrayed a deeper pain. I am happy when I'm with her. Then what changes, Joe? Tell me what I can do to help you. Norma finally looked up at her husband just in time for him to see tears streaming down her cheeks. He hated seeing her like that. If there were any way for him to change the way things were, he would do it in a heartbeat. He was happy once. He lived a quiet and full life. There was no reason why he should feel any different now, except he did. He walked to Norma and took her face in his hands. He looked into her eyes, once so bright and full of joy, and now he saw nothing but pain. He was doing this to her, and it killed him. Something's wrong with me, he said in a low voice, barely able to get the words out. I'm worn out. I'm broken. Norma tilted her head and let out a sigh before asking, Why? Is your life really that bad? Do we not make you happy enough? He kissed her forehead and pulled her close. He wrapped his arms around her as though she would blow away if he ever let her go. I love you, he told her in as firm a voice as he could muster. The two of you are the only thing standing between me and the edge of a cliff, and I never want to hear you talk like this is your fault again, do you hear me? Then why? Joe let go of his wife. He wanted to move away from Maggie's bedroom before continuing this conversation. The world would have plenty of time to be cruel to her without his giving it a head start. As he moved into the living room of their apartment, Joe grabbed a cigarette off of the table and lit it. He took a deep drag and held the smoke in his lungs for as long as he could. He needed time to think. On the table next to the front door, he saw the hat that he wore to work. It looked almost like a police officer's hat, but his job wasn't as fulfilling as that. He didn't get to help people and make the world a better place. All he ever got to do was watch as the world fell apart around him, and he couldn't help but feel every bit of its suffering. He looked back to Norma. She was wringing a handkerchief in her hands, waiting for him to say something. Finally, he said, Do you know what my job was like when we first moved to this city? She didn't respond. Joe continued, I'd walk these streets with my head held high. I'd wave to the people along my route and make small talk when I delivered packages. The kids in the street, they used to toss me their ball as though I was one of their little friends. Sure, things could be tough out there, but things weren't too bad, you know? Now I walk down that street and it's like I'm walking through a cemetery, every day. Norma looked toward the window for just a moment, and Joe could tell that she didn't understand. No matter how hard she tried, she would never understand. That's it? You feel bad for them? She asked him. He wanted to explain it in a way that would make sense, but there wasn't any. He didn't know what to tell her. He sat on the couch and took another drag from his cigarette. Norma moved closer and placed an ashtray on the table next to him. There's this little boy, Billy Jenkins, Joe told her as he blew smoke into the air. His father worked across town in one of those big buildings. They were saving up to move to the country, so the boy could have an open space to grow up in. He was so excited. Those people aren't your family, so I shouldn't feel anything for them? Of course you should. But it's too much. It's not your pain to feel, Joe. I know that. You think I wouldn't let go of it if I could? Don't you think I want to forget what it's like to talk to that boy now? To his mother? Joe stood up and put out his cigarette. He walked to the closet and pulled out his jacket. Norma put a hand over her mouth and pleaded, "Don't go, please stay home tonight." "I just want to forget." "Then why go there? You're only asking for trouble." Joe didn't want to leave. If he could have, he would have closed the blinds and forgotten about the rest of the world. He would hold his wife and try to bring back the look in her eyes that he hadn't seen in too many years. But the world was screaming to him. It was begging for him to do something. He just didn't know what he was supposed to do. As he moved toward the door and placed his hand on the knob, Norma walked to him and put a hand on his shoulder. A wave of love washed over him like a splash of cold water, and he froze in that spot, holding on to that wave for as long as it lasted before the misery of the world smothered it away again. Her voice was quiet as she spoke, as though she hadn't been beaten down almost as much as he was. He hated to hear that weakness in her voice. It wasn't right. She wasn't supposed to live like this. She asked him, "What happened to the boy's father?" He hesitated, knowing that the answer to her question would serve more harm than good. He didn't want to damage her anymore. He wanted to make it all right. Joe turned only halfway around, so that he wouldn't have to look her in the eyes as he said, "He found a new job. He makes more money now than he ever did before." Norma took a deep and shaky breath. He could tell that her eyes were filling with tears even without looking. He could feel a tingle down his own nose as he held back the urge to cry himself. "They're moving to the country, just like they always wanted," he finished, before walking out the door and closing it behind him. As he walked down the hallway toward the stairs, he heard Norma open the door and step into the hallway. She didn't say anything to him as he left. Somewhere in the building, a radio was announcing that the adventures of Babe Ruth was about to begin. A baby was crying. A couple was fighting. Another police car passed with sirens screaming. Joe reached into his pocket and pulled out his keys. 1937. The bar that Joe went to had seen better days. Even the downtrodden were taking their business to better bars with dancing girls and big bands. The Capitol was a hole in the wall. It was a remnant from another time, hidden down a dark alley where nobody was likely to stumble in off the streets. The men who drank there had stumbled long ago. More than one had put a gun to his head, which meant that business was dwindling. He didn't even know why he went there anymore. He used to think that he went there to scratch an itch, but that wasn't the truth. He never craved a drink until he was sitting there in a room full of drunks whose lives were on a downward spiral. The thing that pulled him to that place was the rawness of their suffering. He'd lost track of where his own pain ended and theirs began, because he felt it all. About 2 years earlier, a man came into the bar. His name was Morton Gore, and he'd been a regular customer of the Capitol after the crash. Morton was as raw in nerve as anyone that Joe had ever met, and he thought that it was only a matter of time before Morton took a dive off of the highest building in the city. But then, things changed. When Morton went to the bar that night, he was back on his feet. His suit was pressed, his hair was combed. He had money to throw around, and he did it with as pure a joy as his misery had ever been. Joe sat at the bar that night, staring at a glass of whiskey without ever touching it. It was as though a light had been turned on in a dark room, and it was blinding him. He felt the joy. Then Morton left, and the darkness filled the hole where he'd been standing. It was worse after that. People were reminded of the world that existed out there, away from the misery. They drank more, they cried more, and Joe felt it all. His entire neighborhood was like that. Nobody paid a bill without wondering if they'd be able to do the same next month. Nobody cooked dinner without taking just a little bit less, so that their kids could go to sleep with a slightly fuller stomach. Well, almost nobody. Joe and his family had done pretty well for themselves. He managed to hold on to his job through all of the mess. He could put food on the table and clothes on his little girl's back. He even gave some money away when he saw someone at their lowest point. Norma wanted to move. She wanted to go back to the country and put all of this behind them, but Joe couldn't do it. The suffering was like a magnet that pulled him in. He couldn't leave no matter how much he may have wanted to. He could no more move out of that city than he could stop going to the bar. Even if the world was moving on and the sun was shining somewhere else, the suffering of those people was his suffering. There was no line between them. There was no separating himself from them. He would feel their pain until it was gone, and he was free to feel for himself again. Until that happened, he would spend his nights sitting in the capital, drinking their sorrows away. In the back of the room, there was an old piano. Way back when, it had been used to keep people dancing. When the room was crowded and more laughs than sobs could be heard, the piano was a symbol of happiness. Now its finish was fading, and the young Russian waitress who stood beside the piano sang a soft, sad song in her native language. He didn't know what she was saying, but he didn't need to. Her voice was out of place in that bar. It was pure and sweet, which made its mournful sound all the more painful. Joe swallowed the last of his drink and ordered another. As the bartender, Rummy, went to fetch another bottle, the young waitress walked from the piano and leaned against the bar. She smiled at him. "What did you think of show?" she asked, with just a hint of an accent. Somehow he'd expected her to struggle with her English. He shrugged and looked toward Rummy, wishing that he'd pick up his pace. "I see," the waitress smiled. "You are not here for the show." "No offense. I don't offend easily." Joe looked at the young waitress. Even through the thick cloud of gloom that filled the bar, he could tell that she had joy in her. Her smile wasn't a sales pitch. He could see it in her eyes. "What's your name, kid?" he asked her. "Vasya," she replied. "And I haven't been a kid for a very long time." "Months?" "Years." "I'm Joe." "Nice to meet you, Joe." Joe couldn't help but smile. "You wouldn't say that if you knew me." Vasya took a seat at the bar while Rummy returned with Joe's drink. As Joe took a sip, she seemed to study him before saying, "You don't belong here. Do any of us?" "Do you have a job?" "Yes." "Do you have family that you love?" "More than life." She shook her head and told him, "I have seen a lot of men who belong in a place like this, and you're not one of them. I bet you don't even like taste of whiskey." Rummy turned on the radio and the sound of a newsman's voice filled the air. "Why are you here?" Vasya asked him. He looked down at his glass. He didn't have an answer for her. He couldn't explain that he wasn't sure what he felt or where he belonged anymore. The world didn't make sense as it was, and he had no interest in confusing the poor girl more than she needed to be. "It's practically standing still now. They've dropped ropes out of the nose of the ship, and it's been taken hold of down on the field by a number of men," a voice from the radio reported. Joe and Vasya both looked toward the radio, knowing what was coming next. They'd been playing the same radio broadcast all day, and each time they did, it sent a chill up Joe's spine. The report continued. "It's starting to rain again. The rain has slacked up a little bit. The back motors of the ship are just holding it, just enough to keep it from—" Everyone at the bar held their breath. Joe looked down to his drink and took another sip. "It's burst into flames," said the voice on the radio, before the newsman began to cry and yell at the people to get out of the way. "Oh, the humanity!" The screaming on the radio continued. The pain, the suffering. Joe could practically feel the heat of the fire burning his face, even though the crash of the Hindenburg had happened a day earlier. Vasya lowered her head and mumbled something to herself in Russian. Rummy turned the dial on the radio, and within moments the sound of big band music filled the bar. Everyone turned back to their drinks and their own misery. "The world is falling apart," Joe said, swallowing the last of his whiskey and signaling for another. "We just turn the dial and pretend that it never happened. But even if we don't listen to it, it's still there. It's always there. Maybe someday the explosion will be bigger and we won't be able to ignore it anymore." Norma sat in her apartment, staring at a pair of long needles that she held in her hands. She tried to distract herself by knitting, but it didn't work. Neither did baking, or cleaning, or any of the other ways that she tried to take her mind off of things for the last few years. The screams and cries that she heard on the radio hours earlier were still echoing through her head. She knew that Joe was out there. She knew what a night like this would do to him, yet she'd allowed him to leave. She'd stopped trying to keep him home long ago, and now she spent her days just trying to get by. It was no way to live, and yet she saw no other option. She heard Maggie's bedroom door open, and her eyes shot toward the hallway. Footsteps. She looked at her watch. It was 10:30 at night. Maggie should have been asleep by now. Maggie walked into the living room and looked around before locking her eyes on her mother. For a moment, she said nothing. She was 5 years old, but when Norma looked into the eyes of that little girl, she could see the wisdom of someone much older. It scared Norma. She wanted her daughter to be young and carefree, yet when she looked around that living room and finally to her mother, Maggie seemed to have as much weight on her shoulders as either one of her parents. "Where's Daddy?" Maggie asked, nearly surprising Norma with the sweet and innocent tone of her voice. "Daddy went out, sweetheart," Norma told her. "Why are you still awake?" Maggie walked toward her mother and took a seat beside her as she said, "I had a bad dream. A nightmare can't hurt you. It's only in your mind. It's your imagination." Norma put her knitting needles aside and put an arm around her daughter, pulling her close and holding her tight. "I dreamed that it was storming out, Mommy, and the wind was made of fire." As Maggie told her mother what she dreamed about, she stared out the window as though she could see it all happening again. A look of fear came over her for a moment, and she turned her face toward her mother, hiding her eyes in her mother's sleeve. "It's all right," Norma assured her. "Your dreams can't harm you. They can only scare you, and only if you let them." "We should go find Daddy," Maggie told her mother, in a tone that didn't sound scared anymore. She sounded insistent, as she did when she wanted another cookie after dinner. "Your daddy will be home soon, I promise." "We should find him." "We can't do that." "Why not?" Norma didn't answer her daughter. She was having the same argument with Maggie that she'd had with herself every day for years, and she never did come up with an answer. Every night, Joe came home just a little bit more withdrawn. Every day that she said nothing to him, he lost a little bit more of the man he once was. It killed her to watch it. She wanted to hate him, just like all of the other wives of the men who had turned to alcohol when their lives took a turn for the worst. She wanted to wish that he would go away and never come home, because to hate him would be easy. But she couldn't. When Norma looked into the eyes of her husband, she didn't see a man who was drowning his sorrows or feeling pity for himself at the expense of his family. She saw the man she loved drowning. "Mommy, why can't we go find Daddy?" Maggie asked again. Norma looked up at the clock and then to the window. It was raining outside. She could hear cars driving down the wet street. She knew where he was. He'd never tried to hide it from her. If she wanted to, she could walk right down to the Capitol and grab him. She could drag him home if she needed to. What a sight that would be. She could just picture herself walking into the bar with Maggie in tow, causing a scene and telling him once and for all that he needed to come home. She'd seen other women try it, and it didn't usually turn out well. "Why can't we?" Maggie asked again, this time more impatient. Norma looked toward the closet where her coat was hanging. Why couldn't she? "I used to have a kid," said the man who sat at the end of the bar. Joe had seen him many times before, but they'd never spoken. Joe looked over to him and asked, "What happened?" The man could barely hold his head up. He was sweating and so close to passing out that Joe had half a mind to throw a pillow on the floor to break his fall. He'd had a cigarette sitting in an ashtray next to him, but he hadn't touched it in so long that all that remained was a cigarette-shaped pile of ashes. "What happened? You want to know what happened to my kid?" the man asked, never looking up at Joe. "I'll tell you what happened. This happened. I'm a mess. Just look at me, would you? Am I the type of man that you would want for a father?" Joe looked toward the drink that he held in his hand and decided to set it on the bar. He stood from his stool and walked toward the man at the end of the bar. The floor felt like quicksand under his feet. He wasn't sure that he would make it all the way to the man, but he managed to pull it off and take a seat next to him. "Tell me about your kid," Joe said, but his voice sounded distant to him, like his mouth wasn't connected to his head anymore. "My boy? You want to know about my boy?" the man asked. "Yes, I do." "I love my little boy. You know that, right? You know I'd do anything for my boy, don't you? I'd die for him," the man cried, waving around his now empty glass, but never lifting his head to look at Joe. I should, too, you know? I should die, and he'd be better off. Wouldn't have to say his old man was a drunk. Wouldn't have to lie to his friends and tell them that his pop worked for the president on the other side of the world. Your son doesn't want you to die, Joe told him, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. A wave of emotion flooded over Joe, and tears filled his eyes. He could barely breathe, but he continued to talk to the man. Your son wants his father back. What if his father doesn't exist anymore? What about them? If his father didn't exist, then you wouldn't feel the way you do. Joe took a deep breath, pushing back another wave of tears. The man finally raised his head and looked Joe in the eyes. He saw the emotions that Joe was feeling, and he wiped away his own tears. Geez, mister, you're worse off than I am, the man told him. Joe ignored the man's words and said, You should go home. The man nodded slightly and looked down at the ashtray where his cigarette was burning out. I'm gonna go home, he told Joe, before putting his head down on the bar and falling asleep. Joe turned away from the man and stood from his stool. As he did this, he saw Vasya standing near one of the tables, holding a tray and watching him. She had a curious look in her eye. Joe looked away from her and started to walk toward his own drink once again. When he sat down and waved for Rummy to come over and get him another glass, he saw the bartender look toward Vasya and then shake his head. Sorry, Joe. I think it's time for you to call it a night, Rummy said. Vasya walked up beside Joe and said, You should go home. He would have argued if he thought it would have done him any good, but the girl's 1 week of employment at the Capitol had earned her more sway with Rummy than all the years that Joe had gone there. He wouldn't be getting any more service that night. Joe reached into his pocket and grabbed his car keys. He showed them to Vasya with a smile and said, I think I'll be going. You shouldn't drive, she warned him. Little girl, I do a lot of things that I probably shouldn't. He gave her a nod as he stood and started to walk toward the door. See you tomorrow, Rummy, he called back once he reached the door. Rummy. For the life of him, Joe couldn't remember if that was the bartender's real name or just something that the guys had started calling him over the years. Not that it mattered very much. Rummy was who he was now. It was late, but Maggie was up. Norma knew that the girl wouldn't be going back to bed anytime soon. We should go, Mommy, Maggie insisted, pulling at Norma's arm. She could picture Joe out there sitting at the bar. It was wrong. His little girl was calling for him, and he was out there wasting his nights away like a common drunk. She was tired of sitting at home and keeping quiet. Her bottom lip was trembling. Just the thought of taking action caused her heart to beat faster and her palms to sweat. The screams that she'd heard on the radio continued to echo inside of her. The desperation. She could hear the voice of the reporter yelling, "Get out of the way," over and over again as the airship burned and fell from the sky. This is the worst of the worst catastrophes in the world. Norma was tired of watching the world crash down around her. She was tired of running away. The worst of the worst catastrophes in her life had been happening for years, and all she'd done was stand by and wish it the best of luck. She stood and paced in front of the sofa for a moment, gathering her thoughts as Maggie watched her with both hands balled into fists and eyes wide with urgency. When she turned toward the window, she looked outside and saw the rain coming down. It would be crazy to go out there, especially with a little girl. Then she turned toward the door and thought about how easy it would be to walk through it and start her family on a road towards something better. A new home, a new job for Joe, a new school for Maggie. Through that door, the sun was shining and she wanted to bathe in its light. "Get your coat," she mumbled, in a voice that even she couldn't hear. Maggie squinted her eyes so that she could hear better and asked, "Huh?" Norma turned toward Maggie. She felt her limbs pulsing with strength that she hadn't felt in years. She felt the rush of purpose. "Get your coat," she told Maggie again, this time loudly and looking her little girl directly in the eyes. "We're going to get Daddy." Maggie jumped up and down and clapped her hands together for a few moments before pausing and saying, "I should probably go potty first." Rain was falling when Joe left the bar. The streets weren't as crowded as normal, and those who did walk the sidewalks were in more of a hurry than usual. Nobody wanted to be out there any longer than they had to. The Capitol was comfortable for Joe. He always knew what to expect when he sat at the bar. He knew who would be there and what the mood would be. Out on the streets, there were hundreds of people with hundreds of stories to tell. Misery, joy, heartbreak, elation. Joe hated the street because those people pulled his mind in every direction at once, and he never knew which way was up. Of course, once he reached his own neighborhood, he wouldn't have to worry about that. Where he lived, the warm hum of suffering was constant, loud enough to nag him at all hours, but not as loud as the scream of the capital. As Joe walked up the sidewalk toward his car, he passed a woman who was running up the sidewalk with a newspaper covering her head. He felt humiliated. He felt like the smallest thing on the face of the planet, and he hoped that nobody was looking his way. A little farther up, a man stood on the sidewalk, trying his best to hail a cab, but Joe knew the neighborhood well enough to know that he'd have better luck getting a train to pick him up at that time of night, especially when it was raining. As he passed the man, Joe wanted to punch someone in the face. He wanted to rip the city apart. Joe fumbled with his keys, looking for the one that would open his car. The last thing he wanted was to be stuck out there in the rain. But with his attention focused on his keys, Joe didn't notice himself drifting toward the edge of the sidewalk. He would have walked right into the street if he didn't slam his shoulder against a lamppost. He stopped walking and looked at where he was standing. He looked at the lamppost and then up toward the light, which nearly blinded him. The world was spinning. Every sound was louder than it should have been. Every light was brighter. All he wanted was to get home and bury his face in a pillow. His car was just up the street. All he had to do was make his way to it, climb inside, and he could be home within a matter of minutes. "Daddy has the car, sweetheart," Norma told Maggie as the two of them stood under the awning in front of their building and looked out into the rainy night. The part of her that had stopped fighting years earlier wanted to go back inside and wait for Joe to get home, but she hesitated. In her youth, Norma had been a fighter. Her parents always worried that she would be too much for a boy to handle and nobody would ever want to marry her. But Joe fell in love with that fire. He didn't marry her in spite of who she was. He married her because of who she was. They were supposed to hold each other up and keep each other on track. There were 1,000 factors responsible for making their lives what they were, decisions made and fate falling down upon them. Yet Norma couldn't help but feel as though she had failed to hold up her end of the bargain. She had allowed Joe to sink deeper and deeper over the years, when she should have put her foot down and told him that she'd had enough of that place and those people. He had agreed to move to the city for her. She grew up there. Her family was in the city. He had left his home and moved to hers because he could see how much it hurt her to be away from those things that she loved. But she didn't need them anymore. The older she got and the more she learned about the world, the less she needed her childhood comforts, and the more she just needed to know that her family was safe and happy. He didn't have a home to go back to. His family was gone, his childhood house was gone. Most of his friends had scattered around the country. Norma and Maggie were all that he had in the world, and she needed to make him see what that meant. "Let's go," Maggie called to her over the sound of the rain, pulling on Norma's arm. Norma looked down at her daughter, still thinking, and still trying to build up her resolve. "Daddy has the car," Norma told herself as much as she was telling Maggie. "We'll have to walk up a few blocks before we can catch a cab." She opened her umbrella and took Maggie's hand before saying, "You hold on to my hand, do you hear me? Don't let go." Maggie nodded her head and said, "This is so important, Mommy." "I know it is, sweetheart. Now let's go, really fast." Norma ran from her building and down the street, trying her best to keep the umbrella over Maggie's head as they ran. She wished that she could go faster. She wanted to drop the umbrella and run as fast as her legs would carry her until she could take Joe in her arms and bring him home once and for all. But Maggie could only go so fast. The wind was heavier than Norma originally thought it would be. Each gust blew rain under the umbrella and into her face, blinding her for just a moment or two. If the sidewalk had been more crowded, she would have had to slow down. But it was late, and people tended to stay inside when they didn't have money to spend, especially when the weather was bad. Despite all of those elements which were slowing her down and making her journey unpleasant, Norma felt hope in her heart for the first time in years. It was as though she had woken up from a bad dream and suddenly realized that the monsters weren't real. Joe would feel that hope within her. He would feel the love that she and Maggie had for him. Over everything else that he might have felt, Joe would feel the warmth of his family. She would save him. The windshield wipers weren't fast enough. As the rain fell and the wind blew, Joe's view of the street ahead was blocked by thousands of blurry specks. This was made worse by his drunken condition, which caused every motion to blur his vision and every light to make him squint. His mouth was dry. His eyes felt like they'd swollen to the size of grapefruits. His hands seemed to hesitate every time he tried to move them. For some reason, his car was drifting toward the sidewalk. When Joe tried to correct his course, he found himself driving over the line in the center of the street. All of this just added to his frustration and his fatigue. He wanted to sleep. He wanted some peace and quiet for once in his life. In the car, his emotions were as blurred as those drops of water on his windshield. He'd get a hint of happiness or a hint of anger here and there, but none of those emotions stayed with him. His eyes would fill with tears, and before he knew it, he'd be laughing to himself for no reason at all. Through all of those emotions, the need for sleep stayed with him. His eyelids were heavy, his head was getting harder to hold up, the back of his throat tasted rotten. His skin felt as though he were covered in oil. Every inch of him was begging for air. He opened the window, but taking one hand off the wheel allowed the car to drift toward the sidewalk again. He quickly grabbed hold of the wheel and adjusted. He took a deep breath, counting down the minutes until he could pull over and get out of the car that was suffocating him. He was almost there. Just a few more turns and he would be back with his family. Happiness, despair, love, hate, swirling emotions rushing in and out of him before he could even acknowledge that they existed. And then all of that stopped. Suddenly, a wave of emotion struck him with as much unity and clarity as he found in the bar. Horror. Absolute horror. Joe wanted to vomit. His hands were numb. He couldn't breathe. His palms were sweating and he didn't know why, but he wanted to scream. As he approached the next turn, he could see that the street was lit by the headlights of several police cars. He could hear sirens approaching in the distance. Joe felt cold. The blood drained from all of his limbs. He couldn't turn down that road because it was too full of cars and people, so he pulled over and stepped out into the rain. Each step that he took toward the crowd caused the emotions inside of him to swell more and more. His stomach was tying itself into knots, even though he had no idea what was going on. His chin was trembling. His eyes were watering. His knees felt like they were about to buckle. It was too much for him to handle. As he got closer, he began to make out what people were staring at. A car accident. Someone had jumped the curb and crashed right through a storefront. It was a florist shop, which Joe knew well. It had been struggling to stay open. Its owner was fighting to keep it stocked and to put food on his own table. And something like this would destroy him, but that didn't explain the horror that people were feeling. He pushed his way closer, but still he couldn't see what was going on. He knew the people that were standing around him. He knew the women that were crying and the men who were holding on to them. This was his neighborhood, and these were his people. One of those men turned and saw Joe as he pushed his way through the crowd. Frank Buckley. Joe knew him and was just about to ask him what was going on when Frank let go of his own wife and turned toward Joe. Why would he do that? Why would he let go of his own wife like that? Joe couldn't understand it at first, but then Frank put his hands up and stopped Joe from going any farther. Joe, stop. You don't need to see this, Frank told him. What's going on here? What happened? Joe asked, looking Frank in the eyes. He could see tears. He could feel pain, but he didn't understand it. Joe pushed forward, but Frank held onto him tightly, putting all of his weight into stopping him. I don't understand what's going on, Joe told him. Frank turned his head away, smelling the whiskey on Joe's breath. After a second, he forced himself to look Joe in the eyes and spit out the words, Joe, your family is dead. Joe looked toward the car that had crashed through the florist shop. It wasn't his family. It couldn't be his family because he had the car. You're wrong. That's not my car. That's not my family, he told Frank, almost wanting to smile at the mistake that had been made, but he couldn't. By now, more people were looking at him. Women were sobbing. Men were putting hands on his shoulder and looking at him as though he were the victim in all of this. But he couldn't be. That wasn't his car. That wasn't his family. Frank looked Joe in the eyes. They'd known each other for years. They drank together up until a few weeks earlier. Frank was crying, which caused Joe to cry, but it didn't make sense. None of this made sense. Joe, listen to me, Frank insisted. The man who was driving the car was drunk. He couldn't see straight and he couldn't control it. I don't know why they were out here tonight. Who knows why any of these things happen? But Norma and Maggie..." Joe's eyes narrowed as Frank said their names. His mouth curled, and the world around him seemed to shrink a little bit because all of that horror that he felt around him dulled, just slightly, as rage boiled up inside of him. "Don't say their names like that. That's not them. That's not my car, Frank. Stop saying their names like that." "They were on the sidewalk," Frank told him, half sighing as he spoke those words. He sounded weak. "They were on the sidewalk, Joe. He hit them before he ran through the building and killed himself." Joe looked toward the street and saw an umbrella twisted and broken. It was sitting upside down, filling with rain. "Norma's dead," Frank told him, before breaking into sobs and adding, "Maggie's dead, Joe. Your little girl's dead." The women who stood around them were crying into their handkerchiefs. They couldn't look at him. The men had pity in their eyes, all aimed at Joe. He could see it, but he couldn't feel it. He couldn't feel anything. The umbrella was black with a wooden handle. It looked like the one that Norma owned, but it didn't make sense. Why would they be out there at this time of night? He couldn't accept what Frank was telling him. He shook it off like the nonsense that it was and pushed his way forward, hoping to talk to a police officer and clear up this mess once and for all. He could hear Frank calling him back and others trying to stop him, but their voices were muffled. He pressed on. There were bodies on the sidewalk covered with blankets. He couldn't see their faces, but he could see their legs. He could see Norma's shoes. He could see Maggie's rain boots. He could see their hands sticking out from beneath the blankets, still holding on to each other. Yet it still didn't make sense to him. He didn't believe that it was them because there was no reason why it would be them. Maggie was asleep by the time he left for the bar. Norma wouldn't get her out of bed and take her for a walk at this time of night. One of the police officers approached Joe, keeping his head down. The rain rolled off of his hat as he stood in Joe's way, preventing him from getting any closer to the bodies. When the officer took off his hat, Joe recognized him immediately. His name was Michael O'Shea. His wife's name was Molly. They had 2 daughters and a son. Joe had been delivering their mail for years. Michael's face looked like that of a kid. He had chubby cheeks and wide eyes. Though he was tall and muscular, he always seemed young to Joe. At least, until that moment. In that moment, as the rain soaked his hair and ran down his face, Michael had a look about him that Joe hadn't ever seen before. That was the moment when Joe knew that there was no mistake. Whether it made sense or not, his wife and daughter were gone. He could fight, but nothing would ever change. Nothing would bring them back. Something cracked inside of him that night. All the world seemed to pull back around him. The overwhelming emotion of the city was surpassed by something more raw and more clear than anything he had ever felt before. As he fell to his knees and clutched his chest, Joe felt a pain that he never would have thought possible. It was so powerful that he thought it would rip him in half. He thought he would never move from that spot. He thought the world would come to a halt and he would be frozen in that moment forever, because in that moment, he forgot that there was a world beyond pain. He forgot what it was like to not be screaming. He forgot what it was like to not be alone. Nothing about his life would ever be the same. His future was gone. His past was frozen like a fly in amber. There was nothing he could do to change the way things were. Joe had a fire burning white hot inside of him. He was consumed by hate over what had been done to his family and what had been done to him. The funny thing was, he couldn't hate the man who had jumped the curb and ran his wife and daughter into a mailbox before they fell to the ground and were run over by his tires. He couldn't hate the man who had been drinking. He couldn't hate the man who had killed himself in the process of destroying Joe's world, because had it been a few seconds earlier or a few seconds later, Joe could have been that man. The most horrific thing that he could have ever imagined being done to him had been done. And Joe was denied the right to hate that sad, stupid drunk, because every time he tried to picture the man, the only face he saw was his own. He hated himself. He cursed the day he was born. For the longest time, he couldn't look himself in the mirror without wanting to slit his own throat. But he couldn't do that. What would it accomplish, besides destroying his family even more than it already was? He would never see them again if he took the coward's way out. He had to live with that pain and the guilt for the rest of his life. He had to let their deaths change him in a way that they could be proud of. He had to imagine a day when he would see Maggie again, and she would smile that sweet, beautiful smile of hers. For years before that night, Joe had wondered how so many people could be allowed to suffer. If there was a God in heaven looking down upon us, how could he sit by and do nothing while people lost their jobs and starved? How could he do nothing while women and children died in the street? That night, Joe got his answer. God wasn't the one who ran down his wife and little girl. It wasn't God who put a bottle in that man's hand, and God didn't force him to drink too much before getting behind the wheel of that car. God didn't cause Norma and Maggie to walk down that sidewalk that night. What God did do was give Joe the clarity to see it all for what it was. Choices, decisions, dominoes, placed by man, and usually without any thought or care for what the end result would be when those dominoes eventually fell. Since Eve first ate the forbidden fruit, the world has been nothing but a mess of consequences. That night, Joe's emotional scale was zeroed out. While his own feelings had been drowned out by the masses for as long as he could remember, he now knew where the world ended and he began. He knew how to focus that piece of himself and make everything else fade into background noise. For so long, Norma and Maggie had been the victims of his condition. Now, in death, they turned out to be his cure. He was no longer forced to endure the torment of others. Now he could suffer his own pain. With that new perspective, Joe realized that every so often he could see the dominoes before they fell. Once in a while, he could do some good in the world. He could prevent the suffering. 1939. Looking back beyond the previous 2 years was like looking through a spyglass into the life of a stranger. Everything had changed. Home was once the place where Joe could go to get his bearings. Until Maggie fell asleep, he would be able to have the weight of the world lifted from his shoulders. He could breathe. Now, home was the place which caused him the most pain. Even after all that time, he could hear Maggie's feet on the wood floors as she ran from room to room. He could smell Norma's perfume. Of course, there was a bottle of the stuff sitting on the dresser in his bedroom. Joe couldn't bring himself to get rid of their things or change the way the apartment looked. That apartment was frozen in time, with Maggie's toys sitting right where she'd left them, her blanket still pushed toward the foot of the bed. He could see that she had pushed the blanket off herself. Norma hadn't gone and pulled Maggie out of bed. Maybe Maggie felt sick and needed medicine or a doctor. Joe wasn't home, so what choice did they have but to... He was doing it again. Every time he saw that blanket or Norma's knitting needles, his mind tried to piece together how that night unfolded. It was such a futile task. No matter how he imagined that night, he always came to the same conclusion. It was his fault. He should have been there. He should have had the car at home, so no matter what reason they had for running out into the rain, they wouldn't have been on that sidewalk at that specific moment. Joe usually tried to find a reason not to go back to his apartment. As much as his family haunted that place, so did the man he had once been, the man he would never allow himself to become again. Joe wasn't delivering mail anymore, more dominoes in motion. 3 months after Norma and Maggie died, Norma's mother passed away. After 37 years of marriage, Norma's father, Hugh, was living in that apartment by himself. His one remaining daughter was 100 miles away at school, and the old man was left with the phantom sounds of political disgust echoing through the halls of the home that he had raised a family in. Joe went to see him. They ate meals together. Hugh never looked at Joe the way Joe looked at himself in the mirror. There was no hate or scorn, though Joe had tried more than once to get the old man to hate him in the days after Norma and Maggie died. Hugh felt nothing but love and sympathy for Joe, which nearly drove Joe crazy at first. Once his wife died, Hugh's home became a little darker. The curtains were closed. The tables were left to collect dust. Even with one daughter remaining, Hugh looked around that place, and Joe could tell that he heard the same phantoms of the past that Joe heard each time he went home. Seeing Joe might ease the pain for a little while, but at the end of the day, Hugh was alone. Winter came that year, and Joe spent Christmas with Hugh and Norma's sister, Mary. They were a mess. Joe and Hugh often fell silent and allowed their minds to wander, and poor Mary was given the unenviable task of trying to spread Christmas cheer. After Christmas, she was gone. Joe went home. Hugh went back to his quiet little life, eating less than he should, and never bundling up quite enough. By the following Christmas, Joe and Mary were sitting at the table alone. In spite of all that they'd lost, Joe found himself smiling that Christmas. He saw a little bit of his lost loved ones when he looked at Mary. She had Norma's eyes and Maggie's smile, Eugenia's stubbornness, Hugh's loyalty. She was all the family he had left, and all the family he'd lost. Now he was responsible for her. If anyone so much as looked at Mary the wrong way, they had to answer to her big brother. Hugh's will was simple. Everything in his home went to Mary, along with whatever money he had. Everything in his store was split between Mary and Joe, with Joe given 51% ownership, because Hugh knew as well as Joe that Mary would have hated to be burdened with that shop at her young age. The store was a small bookstore. It was cramped and nothing special to look at, but it had a loyal clientele. No matter how hard times got, people needed an escape. When times were especially hard, Hugh was known to give them that escape for whatever price they could afford. It may have seemed like a bad idea at the time, but as some of those customers started to find work again, his philosophy paid off. Now those customers were known to say, "Keep the change," as they walked out the door. They never knew how close the family shop had been to closing over the years, or how many family heirlooms had been sold in order to keep it open. Joe worked in the shop after he quit his job as a postman. For the most part, he spent his days alone. Peace and quiet had replaced the pleasantries that he exchanged with the people along his route. After the death of his wife and daughter, they all looked at him differently. Even as months and years passed, there was a hint of pity from many of his friends and neighbors, which he supposed would never fully go away. He liked the quiet. He enjoyed talking about books with his customers and reading them in between sales just so he could stay up on the latest trends. He'd made changes to the shop here and there. Now there was a rack of comic books for the kids to browse through as their parents shopped. To be honest, Joe sort of enjoyed the latest addition to the rack, which featured a billionaire playboy who dressed in a bat costume in order to fight crime. The shop was a 20-minute car ride from his apartment. He usually used that commute as an excuse to avoid going home at night. Instead, he slept in the back office, listening to the radio and trying to remember what it felt like to have a normal life. Each night, he came to the same realization. His normal life was miserable, and he had subjected the people he loved the most to that misery for far too long. If only Norma could have lived with the man he had become after her death. If only Maggie could have known a father who was capable of smiling on Christmas Day. But, as his mother always used to tell him, if wishes were horses, beggars would ride. Every morning that he woke up in that back office, Joe had to drive home to take a shower and get a fresh change of clothes, because he refused to move out of that apartment. He couldn't leave them behind. He still saw all of those people who lived in his neighborhood, the ones who hadn't left the city in search of better lives. He watched kids grow into adults long before they should ever have to. All those innocent eyes eventually filled with just as much stress and resentment as the rest of the world. For all the talk of recovery and hope, things seemed just as bad as they'd always been. The only difference now was that people were starting to accept their new way of life. Mary had moved back to the city and lived in her family's apartment just down the street from the bookstore. She'd redecorated the place a bit, getting rid of some of the furniture and telling Joe that she didn't want to feel like she was living at home with her parents. But the truth was, living at home was common when nobody had money. He knew that she needed the place to look different, just so that she wouldn't expect to see her parents sitting in their living room every time she opened the door. She smiled and danced, but Joe could tell that there were moments when she was just as low as anyone. She could hide it from the rest of the world, but she couldn't hide it from him. In her younger years, when Mary first decided to leave home and go to school, she'd had her heart set on becoming a teacher. She loved kids. She loved spending time with Maggie and seemed to have a natural talent for the job. But as time went on, Mary changed her mind and decided that she'd become a nurse. She'd heard stories of the children in the polio ward, and it broke her heart. She wanted to do something to help those kids, even if the notion terrified her parents and made Norma nervous about her spending time with Maggie. Of course, things had changed again. The more Mary learned, the more her heart broke and the less capable she felt. So she went to secretarial school instead. Nobody could ever accuse Mary of being lazy. Nobody could ever say that she lacked motivation. She wanted the world, and nothing else seemed good enough for her. Too bad the world wasn't hiring. Mary returned to her home with no idea where to go next or what to do. She moved into the same home that she'd left years before. She slept in the same bed. America wasn't the land of opportunity anymore. It was a land of people knowing their place and sticking with their own kind, and those without a place were left to fend for themselves. Mary might have thought that she was one of those unlucky people, but she was wrong. As soon as Mary came to town, Joe helped her find her footing. After helping her get her home organized, Joe offered Mary a job in the bookstore. Considering the fact that she was already a part owner in the business, he figured that it was the least he could do. But Mary turned him down. There were too many memories tied to that place, and she wasn't ready to take them on just yet. So Joe hit the street and looked to the people that he knew from his neighborhood in order to find her a job. Had the bookstore been turning a reasonable profit, maybe she wouldn't have needed to work. But Mary would never be content to stay at home and waste away. Unfortunately, times were hard. Unless Mary wanted to dig ditches for government programs, her options were limited. That's why Joe decided to ask Rummy if he could help her out. Since the night his wife and daughter died, Joe hadn't touched a drop of alcohol. He'd never loved the taste of it to begin with, and after that night, the idea of taking a sip turned his stomach. Still, he went to the Capitol and sat at the bar, usually drinking a soda or coffee, or ordering from their short menu of cheap sandwiches. That same atmosphere which had always drawn him to the bar was still there, but Joe knew how to manage it now. He knew how to turn down the volume when he needed to, and dull the roar of the crowd. Every so often, Rummy asked him why he kept going back there if he didn't want to drink. Joe never had a good answer for that question. He didn't enjoy seeing people suffer. He didn't take pleasure in listening to their stories and feeling like he wanted to punch a wall afterward. He just couldn't turn his back on them either. He needed to listen to them for as long as they needed to talk. They needed to know that someone out there understood how they felt, and he needed to try to convince them that they wouldn't find any comfort at the bottom of their glass. Maybe if he'd ever succeeded in getting someone off their stool and back in their home, Rummy would have had a problem with his being there. But Joe wasn't so lucky. While he might be able to do some good in the world outside, within the walls of the Capitol, the Great Depression only got more depressing. At least he could help Mary. Though he was sure that her family would have smacked him in the face if any one of them knew that he'd gotten her a job in a bar, she fit right in. She could talk to the customers in a way that he couldn't. She could make them believe that there was a chance for something better just around the corner. They never had to know that she was settling into a life of compromise, just like they were. And then there was Vasya. For all of the smiles that Mary could bring out of the crowd, Vasya could make them cry. The sound of her voice when she sang by the piano caused the most thirsty of men to put down their glass and stare. Vasya wasn't in the business of serving hope. She usually told people what they needed to hear, rather than what they wanted. She wasn't rude or uncaring, but she saw no good in living in a dream. To her, the world was full of possibility, as long as you were willing to sacrifice. It was not a message that many wanted to hear in the bar, so she usually refrained from lecturing, but Joe found her honesty refreshing. That was his world now. No more warm meals waiting for him when he got home. No illusions of growing old with the woman he loved, or chasing grandkids around the house. But it could be worse, and he was done complaining.
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn and fade.